One of the accomplishments, well, if you want to use that word, one of the accomplishments of consumerism has been the ability to take something and then completely, utterly empty it of its original meaning, leaving it only as an example, a symbol of a company or a product, something that is bought and used and then discarded. When Michelangelo created the scene of Adam and Eve eating the fruit of the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge, Michelangelo chose an apple. It's hard for us to imagine in our time because nearly everything that we eat today has some kind of sugar or sweetness to it. But for a very long time, people lived in a world where fruit was seasonal and the average person seldom ate anything that was sweet. And so the red radiance and the otherworldly sweet tartness of an apple was imagined as being seductive and irrepressible. Today it's a symbol of a computer company. Now Coke wasn't such a benign invention. Still known today as Coca-Cola, it was developed in the late 1800s by mixing two ingredients together. The first was cocaine, which was believed then to be a miracle drug capable of curing everything from colds to cancer, and the cola nut, which is very high in caffeine. In 1929, the cocaine was removed from the drink, but we still call it Coke. And Starbucks. That's not a word you're going to want to hear in about 15 hours, so I'm using it now. Today, it is the symbol of the world's largest coffee chain, with 35,000 locations worldwide and revenue of over $32 billion annually. But the next time that you saunter out with your half-calf, non-fat, extra-hot, no foam with a splash of almond milk, take a look at the cup. On the cup, there is a logo that features a mermaid. The logo was inspired by a name, Starbuck. Starbuck was a central character in Herman Melville's 19th century classic called Moby Dick. It was the name of the first mate of the ship, who, when new recruits were coming on board the boat to undertake the most dangerous of all voyages in the 19th century, to hunt whales, Starbuck would call the group together and warn them by saying, "I will have no man on this boat who is not afraid." I often wish that I could have that on my desk or on my phone as a reminder of the truth, a deep truth about life. Life is a dangerous voyage, and we are right to be afraid. Our inclination is to believe that the world and the universe are stable and orderly things, that with science and knowledge we can lift the hood up and see the engine working, all neat and clean and humming along as it should, in ways that we expect and understand. And this is seen in the very name that we give for these things. The word for the universe, cosmos in Greek, means order. That's also where the word cosmetic comes from. It's the things that we use to make everything neat and orderly and presentable. But for all the order that is in the natural universe, the sun rises and the sun sets, the stars always shine at night, the moon cycle runs for 29.47 days every month, spring to summer and summer to fall. The exception to all of that order is on full display tonight. It's me and you. We are nothing like the orderliness of the universe. Seen in the language of ancient Jewish tradition, those rabbis said that look how different the vessels that we make are the ones that God makes. When someone pours hot and cold water into a glass vessel, it shatters. But this is nothing like the vessels that God makes. Because when God made humans, He filled us with the forces of hot and cold, with deep and powerful emotions of anger and sadness and love and happiness and hope and fear. And what is it that prevents you from cracking? Look carefully at the words inside the machzor, the prayer book for this evening, and yes, I know, the English translations read like Chaucer and Shakespeare, but don't let that stop you. Look carefully at the words. In it, you will see the human story, your story, of success and failure and heartache and disappointment, and right along each is the spoken dream of the possibility to begin again. The message of Kol Nidre and Yom Kippur and Judaism writ large is not, you are not the sum merely of what you have done up to now. You are also what you dream that you could be. After all, the beginnings with Jacob and then Joseph of our story begins with the people who were filled with dreams. And maybe it is that we come here year after year by the push and pull of some invisible habit, like the birds flying south or north for the season, but I don't think so. I think maybe in ways that we are short of words for, but ways that we know deep in our soul, that there is something to be found here that you cannot live without. In the prayers and the music, there is something indispensable to how you think and live and manage in a torrential world. I also know that many, many people see beauty in what you see tonight. Consider that the most popular movie this week on Netflix is about a rabbi. Consider that Israel won the popular vote for the 2024 Eurovision competition. Consider that you are the heirs of this great tradition, which gave birth to a great people, which inspired the great words of this Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tzar mi'od. The whole world is a very narrow bridge. But what is most important is not to be afraid. Whatever hate you may see or feel outside is insignificant to the beauty and hopefulness that is in here, in you, in us. The world is a narrow bridge, but gifted with the messages of our prophets and sages, we not only dream that we can be better, we actually pray to be so. And this year, may God grant your prayers. Everyone, please rise. In my third year in university, which in Israel also happens to be your final year, my political philosophy class ordered each of us to make a presentation on game theory. So I chose the Cuban Missile Crisis to describe and explain one of the elements of game theory. Now, all this was a very long time ago. The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in 1962. I made this presentation in 1989. But to it, there is a question which hovered over me this past year that made me think back to all of this. Because apart from natural disasters, things like hurricanes and floods and tornadoes and droughts, there really is no enemy posing a mortal threat to the United States of America. With Canada to the north and Mexico to the south, with two oceans on either coast, Americans don't worry that their way of life and country could disappear tomorrow. The 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the only time in almost 250 years of American history that people considered it possible that the United States might not exist. Otherwise, and today it is incomprehensible. The same is true for here in Canada, which is framed by oceans on either side, protected by the military umbrella of the most powerful country in the world. No Canadian could seriously ever imagine this country being destroyed. But there is not a Jew alive who cannot close their eyes and quickly believe how Israel and with it, our collective global safety could vanish in an instant. We think this all the time. The tentacles of the genocidal Iranian octopus surround Israel and is at the threshold of becoming now a nuclear power. Israel is at war now for over a year. Nearly 101 hostages are still being captive. Some liberal democracies in the West believe that Israel not to no longer be the victim, but to be the problem, despite that this is a war not of its making or its choosing. And we, all of us, Israelis and diaspora Jews, myself included, was absolutely convinced that Tel Aviv was actually Manhattan, that Israel was the land of sushi and NASDAQ, and then everything was sababa, everything was great. We believed that it was possible to make a Scandinavian peace, to live like the Dutch and ignore the jungle that our villa was being built in. On October 7th, all of that was shown to be an utter lie. But need I remind you why and how Zionism is a Jewish idea? Because Zionism didn't only look to save the Jews, it looked to change the Jews. The national anthem of the State of Israel is the Hatikva, the hope. There are still few countries that can parallel Israel's ingenuity, creativity, and initiative. If the situation now is bad, and indeed in this moment it is, we don't need to look for hope. We need to make it. In his commentary on the verse, Vishuatcha kiviti Adonai, with God we wait for your salvation, the 18th century Italian rabbi Moshe Luzzatto tells us that the word for hope in Hebrew, tikva, is the same word in Hebrew as to draw a line. In other words, hope is a choice. It is to draw a line in the sand and say this here and no more. It is to make a new path to something better. It says that hope is not something we wait for, it is something you make. This past spring, Lisa and I were in Israel, and on our last day there, we made our way to one of the many impromptu memorial sites throughout Tel Aviv. On it were images of children, the young, the old, and families who all perished on October the 7th. And the pictures of some of the over 250 soldiers who have given their lives since the start of the war, and another nearly 700 from that moment. And in one place by the family of a fallen soldier named Yaakov Tsanani were these words, Basof, in the end, Yeh beseder, everything will be okay. V'makolo beseder, and if everything is not yet okay, Siman shezelo asof, it's a sign that we're not at the end yet. Before us stands a choice to make. It is to be October 7th or October 8th Jews. There's no going back to October the 6th, which is the choice to be either a victim or a victor, to survive or perish, to be strong or weak. I know the choice to make, and we would do well to remember the words of Imre Kertész. Kertész was a Nobel Prize laureate for the book Fateless, of his experience in Auschwitz as a teenager. An Hungarian Jew, he returned to Budapest and lived out his life as a pacifist, a harsh critic of military confrontationalism, and an avowed humanist. But during a visit to Israel, a foreign journalist aware of Kertész's leftist leanings asked him, "How does it feel for you to see a Star of David on a tank?" "Much better," he said, "than seeing it on my concentration camp uniform." You see, Kertész was a dreamer, but he was a realist. The choice to build in hope, to vote for strength, to commit to the dreams of what will come is now in your hands, literally. Throughout this year, many of you have come to me asking, what can we do? How do we help Israel? What can and should be our answer to what we see and hear around us? And throughout time, the Jewish answer has always been to build. Every generation of Jews has had to pay the price to be Jewish. Could we now say that this is our moment? I think generations ahead will look back and know how we answered when we were called upon. The Israel Bond Appeal card is there for you. It has been on your seat. I ask you now to take it in your hand, consider the options to build a stronger, freer, hopeful, more prouder Jewish world. Take a moment, please. The ushers will be making their way down the aisle to collect your tab cards. Gamar Chatima Tova. This past June, when I was in Berlin teaching, I teach in rabbinical school there, and there was about 4 or 5 days that we had off in between classes, and Lisa and I decided that we were going to go to northern Germany, to the Rhineland, which is the source, the birthplace of who we are. We are called Ashkenazic Jews. The classic Hebrew rabbinic word for Germany is Ashkenaz. So the Rhineland is the cradle of Ashkenazic Jewish civilization. And one of the small cities that is there is called Worms, and it was where the great biblical commentator Rashi studied and lived. In fact, the synagogue there is named after him. It is called the Rashi Synagogue. It is of note, you should pay attention, that when Martin Luther, the founder of Lutheranism, when he decided to translate the Bible into German, he used Rashi's explanations. The Jewish community in Worms prospered. There were ebbs and flows. It grew and it waned a bit, but overwhelmingly it prospered immensely. So much so that in the mid-1800s, they actually expanded the shul, the synagogue there. That, of course, was until Kristallnacht in 1938. The Jewish community was rounded up, and they were deported. Many of them were murdered. And when the Jewish community came back in 45 and 46 and 47, they repaired and rebuilt. And the last thing that they did before they rededicated the beautiful Rashi Synagogue that is over 1,000 years old is that they placed a memorial board in the center of the synagogue to commemorate and mark the names of all those people in the community who had been victims of the Shoah of the Holocaust. And when we walked into the synagogue and saw the memorial board, as we drew closer, we saw that 13 of the names, of the dozens and dozens of names, 13 of them have been scraped off. And why? Because those 13 people were presumed to have died. And when they came back and saw their names on the memorial board, he scratched it off. Which is the question for this evening. Why didn't they just replace the board? And the reason why they didn't replace the board is because it is an echo of what the prophet Samuel said more than 2,700 years ago. Samuel said, Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker, that the eternity of the Jewish people is not a lie. That when people think that they have done a sin, we know better. That there will be always those who come after us. Always those who will carry our voices. The prophet Samuel began the idea, but you know the expression that we say today. Am Yisrael Chai.